I'm Sammie Veeler. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I'm a co-founder of New Art City Virtual Art Space.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being with us today, Sammy. So, what is your earliest memory you have of working with art and or technology?
Well, I've always had a computer. My family were like early adopters of the internet, so I've kind of had the privilege of observing a lot of phases of before and after the internet became quote unquote useful. And I had a career in technology working in normal technology companies. And then I found New Art City, and that was my sort of introduction to the 3D web. And also, it coincided with my gender transition, which sort of forced my hand regarding authenticity in a lot of other regards, which sort of made me want to be an artist. And so this sort of ended up merging the skills that I had stolen from the traditional tech world and the sort of new research area in like how to become an artist, and how to sort of use new media to tell this story of my transition.
One of the things that I really love about the way that you approach community and community building is your generosity with your own creative gestures. So, Sammy's Garden, and is that Sammy's?
Oh, yeah, Shape Garden.
Sammy's Shape Garden. It's a 3D world that you've built in New Art City, but it's also this kind of exploratory tutorial. So it's something that I use as a pedagogical tool in my coursework. Will you talk a little bit about the way that you approach kind of community building, both through those types of gestures, but you're also very active in other channels that sit adjacent to New Art City, like Discord. Can you talk a little bit about community building and the way that you see New Art City and your particular role coexisting and operating?
Yeah, so the way that we view community building is, I mean, it's really tied up with everything that we're doing. That we're like a startup, I think, is very technology first, and we really view ourselves more like infrastructure, even if it's made of the same stuff. We want to provide both technical and cultural infrastructure to be successful on the 3D web. And so we've always prioritized people who are disadvantaged by structural injustice, and we've tried to sort of mobilize the resources that we have to help amplify their work. And that goes through programs like residencies, which have a lot of one-on-one time along with a stipend, and then commissions. And we also make a point of giving free space to anybody who sort of meets our curation goals. And so we can offer this kind of in-kind support. And the Shape Garden is another piece of this, where if I'm being paid to make a shape for a client, I can then turn that into a resource that anybody on the site can use. And so, yes, we really want to synthesize technological infrastructure and cultural infrastructure.
You talk in your bio about working to redistribute privilege from high density to low density, and you've kind of talked around that in the last few answers, but will you kind of dive into the center of that question? How do you see New Art City and the possibilities of Web 3D doing that high density to low density work?
Right, and I think that's maybe one of the parts I left out of my previous answer. We want New Art City to act as a vector between high density and low density, a vector for privilege to travel between high density and low density. And so we attracted a lot of institutional collaborators who were able to give us financial resources. And we made a point of rededicating 20% of that revenue back to supporting specific projects by artists that we wanted to support. And I think this also kind of speaks to New Art City as a conduit, as a gathering place. And so, a lot of what we do is simply open a door for somebody to be creative and reduce their barriers to like being able to get started. And I think that's why we've been able to accomplish so much. And the homepage speaks for itself. We've had 160 public shows that feature over 4,000 artists, and a lot of these people are showing in a gallery for the first time.
You talk to some of the kind of structural, so those are kind of social tools and philosophies, operational philosophies. You're also a massive advocate of accessibility. And one of the things New Art City does that I haven't seen any other kind of web 3D toolkit even attempting to address is accessibility. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways in which you're implementing tools and features to make that the experience more accessible both for builders but also for visitors?
Right. And so what I touched on before in terms of accessibility is that we we want to make it, or like accessibility is sort of access plus inclusion. We want to make it easy to enter, and we also want to invite people who are historically excluded. And so in terms of technical features, we have a screen reader accessible catalog view that allows blind people to access the art exhibitions. And we also are working to make the tools of making your exhibition accessible, like the cultural understanding of how to write good alt text, accessible to our users as well. And we've also convened an accessibility panel that we meet with every 6 weeks or so, who helps us stay accountable to our accessibility goals and define future goals and distribute resources to people who can use them. And so there are four different like experts in sort of fields of disability arts and also access and also publishing: Charlotte Strange, Viv Chu, Andy Slater, and Natalie Decker. And they've been really valuable. And this is a way to sort of build community governance into the way that we curate and the way that we distribute resources.
That's beautiful. I think it's hard. So one of the things that we're doing right now is kind of looking into the history of Web 3D, but also kind of looking, taking into account where we are today. And it's impossible to kind of move in any Web 3D space without encountering this kind of overarching term of the metaverse. How does New Art City situate itself in relation to that term?
We're one of a very few 3D worlds that hasn't rebranded to describe ourselves as a metaverse or building the metaverse. And I mean, the thing about this expression is that it seems to me to be more like a marketing term for a product that is trying to be sold to me by the same people who profited from Web 2. And it doesn't really seem to exist. And I'm not wholly convinced that most people really want to socialize on the web in this way. Like if you look at Second Life, it has maybe 1 million, something like 1 million or 10 million, very small amount in terms of like platform capitalism, but they have a lot of dedicated users who have been using it for a long time. And this is evidence that there are some people who want to socialize this way. And there are lots of people who, of course, play multiplayer games. But I think making people make the jump to socialize online in that way, I think the tools of publishing and distributing media and communicating have been unequally distributed. And when a platform like Facebook's primary goal is to sell advertisements and their secondary goal is to enable communication, then it will never advance as a communication tool. And so what I'm really interested in is more expansive definitions of how we can communicate media and ideas fluidly with one another in a way that's preservable. Because if you look at Discord or Instagram, if you export your messages, there's nothing you can really do with them in a preservation sense because everything is basically anonymized and it's not in digestible format. And so basically their assumption is that you will never have a meaningful conversation on their platform. And that's a bigger problem to me than, avatars or whatever.
Will you talk a little bit about like archivalness and like what New Art City's approach to that kind of like creation, ownership, and history?
Right. Well, JavaScript is really advantageous as a format to gather these things where like we have file formats that are collected into this 3D world, and then you can export that as plain code. And the longevity of that, it's like JavaScript is backward compatible with itself and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And so if you can preserve those files, you can self-host an exhibition and it should 10 years from now be about the same as it was before. And And I think there's more work to be done in terms of making things that both perform well in the like exhibition format, but also contain the archival formats of files, which is sort of more in line with museum preservation. I think this has kind of broad-reaching capabilities for like an artist to document their work as they make it and to have kind of a single source of truth of like what is finished that's in a format that includes all of the metadata and alt text, but also sort of exhibition instructions and the sort of oral history and documentation into sort of a complete package.
You mentioned kind of this relationship with institutions like a museum, like what happens when they acquire a work, and there's different layers when we're thinking about archives and institutions, but you have worked with some institutions on exhibitions in New Art City. And so I'm wondering how you see these institutions navigating the relationship between the virtual and physical installations that they also kind of host.
It's interesting, right? Because we were kind of a magnet, especially during the earlier stages of the pandemic, when institutions were trying to exhibit virtually for the first time. And it was just this huge hotbed of experimentation. And we were one of many like innovative formats that were in 2D and in 3D. Like Distant Gallery is an excellent example of a format that remained in 2D, but still had a lot of resonance. And so we were lucky to experiment with a lot of institutions about sort of how can we authentically use Web 3D to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish in physical space. And so we tried the very like cut and dried method of like the way that a curator would install a physical with Format Festival in 2020. It was a 17 room exhibition featuring something like 300 artists, I think. And the curators were familiar with laying spaces out in physical space. And so they gave us wall layouts of all of the artworks. And we've never done that since, but it was just fascinating to say, okay, if we were going to do this one-to-one, how would we do it? But each time we do this, we learn more about what techniques that we can then share with other people. And that gets diffused back out through things like our residency.
Are there examples of exhibitions that you think, kind of as a counterpoint to let's just take a physical installation and stick it into virtual space, that are like kind of, exploring alternate ways of viewership and exhibition?
The perfect example is the one that we collaborated on, the Identity Factory, which was a virtual didactic companion to the installation of Hito Sterl's Factory of the Sun at the San Jose Museum of Art. Because of the exhibition requirements of that piece, which are extremely stringent, and it's, this is like product of the old art world where it was literally acquired. It was like shown at the Venice Biennale, and then it's jointly owned by 3 museums. And so we were not allowed to recreate the elements of the installation or show the video that is installed in it. We had to work with kind of around the edges of thematically the iconography that existed, and then build a game around the sort of core mechanic of the piece as we saw it, which is like, yeah, that is about as far from a one-to-one recreation of a photography exhibition as I can imagine.
And so New Art City, in addition to providing toolkit for artists to make their own 3D websites, you're obviously also doing some consulting work. Has anything surprised you through that kind of consulting work, or is there a project that let me just leave it there. Has anything surprised you through that consulting work?
I mean, it's all new to me, and so yeah, each time we collaborate with somebody, it raises new questions we might not have thought to ask, and forces us to, push the boundaries of both our technical and curatorial abilities. Like, I'm still really new as a curator, and it's very interesting to have worked supporting so many curators and like bringing together this unusual intersection of expertise.
We've talked a little bit about the artists in residency program. I'm sure it looks different for every artist who's going through it, but can you kind of walk us through what that might look like for someone?
Yeah, we're on our fourth resident now who has his opening on Monday next week. And basically, the format of the residency is relatively fluid, but it has some basic structure where somebody comes to us with an idea and we say, yes, we would like to support this idea. And they meet with our team once a week for a month, which should help them think through the conceptual components of the piece and then sort of draw from our strategies and work of like how to actually install this and sort of bring in their own ideas, and then we kind of merge those over that period, and then there's an exhibition, and each one has been slightly different. Hisu Kwan was our first resident, and she created a digital shrine and had multiple like ritual events for her autobiographical feminist religion, where she 3D scanned a potluck and all of the people at it and put it in the ancestor shrine. And she also did a live stream of a cooking show. And so what I really like about the format is that we get to commission works, and it's not sort of a typical gallery relationship where we're going to be selling pieces. We get to curate a show that has no direct commercial ambition, which is, I think, a really beautiful contrast to the kind of carrot and stick of selling artifact for money in physical space or with NFTs. And so it ends up drawing a really consistent curatorial theme, and also like a significant departure from like things that we get to see in other contexts. And this is sort of meant to be a moving body of people, where after we get to a certain number of residents, these people will help us decide who is the next resident, both by nominating people and by going through the submissions through our form.
Is that also like through the residency program, through your weekly meetings with artists, is it also a way for you to kind of beta test or like, you know, feature find, or are you purely in a kind of a supportive production like role there?
We really try to stay in the supportive production role, just because we're a small enough team that like developing new features to support a specific exhibition ends up taking us out of like building the broader infrastructure. But we have ended up finding a lot, or like building a lot of infrastructure that ended up being used by other users, like some of our basic interactions, like when like you can make a sound play when you reach an object, things like this. And I mean, right, so like institutions teach us in one way, and then artists who are like pushing the boundaries both conceptually and technically of what we can do also teach us ways that we could use the tool in a way that we might not have expected.
So both that kind of technical push and also kind of conceptual push, thinking about this transition and the failures of Web 2, what do you want to see kind of built into Web 3? Do you think about New Art City as a part of that kind of transition?
The thing about Web3, or like if you want to invent, people will always say, oh, Web3, Neil Stephenson or whatever. And if it's like, Web2 was a marketing term created by Tim O'Reilly to sell consulting services. And so if you look at the people who market the term Web3, Mark Andreessen is at the top of the list. And Mark Andreessen made a killing on Web2, and he also invented the browser, right? So it's like, it's trying to offer an alternative while also enforcing a false teleology. And so insofar as I am working with a lot of people who call what they're doing Web3, I'm willing to say that I'm part of this movement, but I think my role in it has been somewhat polemical, that I'm often invited to perform expertise on Web3, and I think I usually take a palatably critical tone. I always try to be peaceable and sporting.
There's a Venkatesh Roy, he's a media kind of theorist and consultant, but he coined this term cozy web to kind of talk about, the pulling back from the kind of public facing and capitalist platforms into smaller, more self-decided networks.
Exactly.
So Discord could be something like that. I think New Art City could also be that too, and part of part of cozy web is also trust building and a reaction to the fact that nobody trusts these kind of, major platforms. So
Well,
like,
trust
yeah,
is
I
a
do
great
think,
thing
yeah.
to talk about here, right? That like there's the blockchain folks will talk about a trustless system, and I view trust as one of the great delights of living. To like build solidarity with real people is like why I'm here. And so what you said about the cozy web really resonates, that like the platform era requires economies of scale. Therefore, user acquisition is the priority, and it has to be everything to everyone. And I think the beauty of the pre-Web 2 era is that there were lots of purpose-built spaces that were self-governing and had sort of a narrower purpose, as so they would draw like a more cohesive group of people in. And that led to much more substantive online friendships than you can enjoy. I mean, obviously, I've met many great friends on Twitter, and that's maybe an exception to any other social media platform. But I think New Art City really aims to be a community that serves artists first, and a place where artists can gather across a lot of different domains. I think what makes us special in the Web3 space is like we're not wholly adopting crypto, but we have been showing NFTs since before NFTs became really popular. And it's one of the only places that's a crossroads between folks who are fully all in on NFTs and who absolutely hate them.
I love that. So, and we could go down the crypto wormhole, but I actually think maybe reorienting and kind of thinking about your role as a steward in this space, and more broadly, kind of around thinking around digital creativity, production, and meaning making in the world. What is your vision for the future regarding emerging artist roles and impact for the next generation?
That's a great question. Vision of the future.
It's a mean thing to
I
ask.
had like a sentence like chambered, and then I need to think back.
Yeah, yeah. It's a mean thing to ask, especially when you're working so kind of close to like what's the next project, or like what
Right.
3 weeks from now.
So the part that I was forgetting was the stewardship, right? And so we definitely view ourselves as like a new type of art institution. And I'm really inspired by institutions like EAI, which offer kind of an alternative paradigm to distribution and publishing of this new media video. And so in the same way, I want to offer a distinct alternative to sort of transactional modes of distribution and preservation, and sort of try to be a cultural steward of this sort of ready-made archive. If I like one thing I've noticed through judging a lot of grant applications and like being in touch with a lot of people in a similar space is that archives are one of the most popular sort of formats for grants to take place in like lately, that like people really want to preserve cultural memory in these ways that was completely excluded in the previous generation. That like history is something that you write, and like curation is something that everybody must do. If we learned in the previous century that everyone is an artist, there's too much information. There's simply too many images in this century for everybody to not be a curator. And so I want to empower people to curate and make meaning from information of all formats and share it freely with one another.